And with that, we want to move to the final speaker of the session, Ajay Phatak, from he's an IIT Bombay alumni, a thought leader in ecology and economics. Currently, he's a trustee and faculty at the Ecological Society and teaches environmental history, energy, ecological economics, and business and society and sustainability. He's also on the board of trustees of TARE Policy Center, an NGO working in environment policy, and teaches at the Symbiosis SMC HRD. He advises early stage startup companies and healthcare in the environment space, and is a co-founder of Smart Vitals, a company focused on remote patient monitoring. And he's here to give us a social ecological perspective on net zero. So with that, please take the floor.
So I'm going to take a little bit of step back and focus on some of these two areas. One, which is the social ecological aspect, which is improving carbon sequestration potential, reducing energy use, and some of the other aspects. And the other part is more socio-economic, because agriculture is one of the very large emitters of carbon, and very rarely all of us talk about it, primarily because we need to eat food every day. But we will also have to look at that wedge and see what we can do in the agriculture space, and even some of the other areas where we can just at least touch upon. So that's what I would like to do in the next 15 minutes or so. So if you look at this chart, then the green line, which is agriculture, it emits close to 700 million plus tons of carbon a year. This is India data, and that is only second to the electricity use. Electricity use otherwise by all of the electricity use. So this is an important bucket that we need to keep an eye on, and we will just look at what that means. If you look at putting the whole discussion in a slide, very simply speaking, then what we probably need to do is we first have to assess where we are. We have to imagine where we want to be, and then find out how we are going to go from place A to place B. And then there are two parts. One is there is going to be, when we are talking about assessing where we are and where we want to go, we also have to look at both aspects. One is there is going to be pockets where increase in energy use is inevitable, like what Ajay was talking about, that there is a large population with very little access to power, electricity and energy. So that sector or section of society is going to consume more, and that we have to make sure that we have that very well in part of the equation, which we normally do have. And the second part is what are the avenues for us to reduce our energy consumption. A very simple energy balance, so to say, if you start looking at. In the bucket of reducing carbon emissions, we have again few action items. Some of the action items may be valid for certain set of population, some of the action items may be valid for other set of population. So doing with less and eliminate what you can in all the sectors. So when I say all the sectors, I'm talking about absolutely everything that has to be assessed and examined as to whether we can reduce. That's very, very fundamental to all our discussions as far as net zero emissions are concerned, or for that matter, reducing carbon emission is concerned. Another second point, I think it's very critical, and somehow many of us don't look at it in that particular fashion, is can we reduce use before jumping to improving efficiency? Now many times we believe that improving efficiency will reduce use. But actually we'll have to find opportunities to reduce use first and then improve efficiency. Otherwise Jevons paradox kicks in, and many of you might know that over a period of time, whenever there has been energy efficiency improvement in gadgets and widgets, the total amount of energy consumption has increased rather than having come down, because number of things that you started selling and using became far too prevalent. So for that particular reason, it is important to figure out whether there is energy use reduction or the mechanism if you can find to reduce energy use first, and then say, okay, now I know instead of 100 watts, the same thing can be done in, let's say, 20 kilowatt hours instead of 100 kilowatt hours. Now I find out, now that I can do it in 120 kilowatt hours, can I reduce my efficiency, increase my efficiency further so that 20 can become 10? Instead, what happens is we say that no, I need this thing, I'm going to use this 100 kilowatt hour and say that I'm going to increase its efficiency and get it down to 50. Once I get it down to 50, instead of using 1, I start using 3. And then I go to 150 instead of reducing it to 50. So that's why the second bullet is very important, and that has to become actually a driver of policy. The third is relevant in case of many things that we do. So can you explore alternate ways of consumption? So as an example, now this is a closed room, all the blinds are closed. Unfortunately, of course, there is not enough sunlight today. But the same room could have been designed differently so that during daytime there are no need of illumination. Right? And so it's an alternate way. I still need light, but I don't necessarily need tube lights. And I think that's something which is also a very important aspect that we need to start looking at. And of course, last is improve energy efficiency. I've already said that is the next step. So that's on the reducing carbon emissions. And the second part is, can I increase carbon sequestration and therefore I make space for my potential energy use increase in the other bucket. And that's about most of the aspects of ecological and social issues you will see come into the right part, while techno-economic issues many times and maybe sometimes rethinking and innovating would come on the left side bucket. Now here are some numbers. These are only guidelines. Don't pick me up whether 28% is right or 22% is right, etc. But these numbers are very important. This decade was declared as decade of ecological restoration. We have roughly 11% gap between what we want at around 2030 and what we have today in 2020. This was, I think, a couple of years back, 2020. So we have an 11% gap between our forest cover, and we would like to increase our forest cover by 11%. It is a great opportunity for sequestration. So that's part one. Second part, Praveen already talked in the morning that 28% of land is considered barren, which means nothing can be done there. Now there is again an opportunity where with the experiments like 14 trees, that this land can be again a potential carbon sink. A very large proportion of our population, almost 55% of our population is in agriculture. Now, there are two parts very important. One is resource intensive practices, and can we do something about this aspect of resource intensive practices? And the second part, again, which is something which is not really looked at too very well, is a very large percentage of population, the farmer population, is working on rain-fed agriculture. Now rain-fed agriculture, and they are actually part of those maybe bottom 20% or bottom 10% set of people who need some assistance, some help in terms of ability to get to use additional energy also, and basically create some kind of a security for them. So this rain-fed agriculture aspect has to be looked at even more carefully, because that's one of the very interesting and important bucket where there is a lot of possibility of doing interesting ecological experiments as well. And then the fourth point, I think Vijay just mentioned when he closed his session, is top 10% garner and used enormous amount of resources and of course energy resources as well. And what is possible? Are there ways to tax? Are there ways to appeal and say that you don't use? Whatever the ways are, but there is an opportunity that they can make space for again bottom 20%, 30%, 40% to make sure that energy equity can be restored without really need for enormously increasing use of energy. So one way of looking at energy is increasing. You decide and say that because the Americans consume so much, I want to go there in 10 years. And because that consumption that they have had over a period of time have made them prosperous, we will also become prosperous. That's one way of thinking. The second way of thinking is how can we actually balance these three different things out for ourselves in our own context, for our own country. And I think that is a thought that we need to put forth and see how we can work towards appropriate policies. And I think rest of the things I will talk about one by one. So to assess where we are, first point is pretty important. We are so focused on us as humans that we have a gross disregard for other life forms. Now, while it might be okay in the short term, we pretty much know, based on our 6th grade biology book, that there is this pyramid, the web of life, that if you decide to disregard other life, the other life will disregard you very quickly. And it is important to say that we have to keep looking at all the life forms when we talk about development, we talk about energy use, we talk about resource use. In that context, it is very important to look at all of life. For that matter, our constitution also provides this whole right to life. And when you say right to life, it's not only for humans, it's actually for all life forms. And if we decide to truly go by the constitution, I think we have a better opportunity to go further. Urbanization and associated growth is creating a backward pressure on both natural resources and the natural resource base as well, and in the rural and tribal areas as they get connected to the urban centers. Third point essentially talks about, and I think one of our speakers who was talking about these, some of the machines that he was making for farm use did allude to that. And which is, we have to have a context. Now we cannot have a solution which is context free and say that that's because of diversity, so many geoclimatic regions, so many different regions in which we do our agriculture. So we cannot have a cookie cutter solution. We cannot have a solution which works in Kanpur, which is going to work in Jammu, and the same thing is going to work in Thiruvananthapuram, for example. You have very different regions, very different contexts, and your solutions are going to be different. So we have to be cognizant of the fact that we cannot have a same solution and which can be scaled and replicated everywhere in the country. So far, we have had this, I call it as the excessive hope of trickle-down prosperity. In the sense that, the rich will become richer and they start consuming more and so on and so forth, and ultimately the money will trickle down or the resources will trickle down, and there is a limitation to what it can do. So again, there is possibly a need for rethinking. And we have a significant disguised employment, especially when you're talking about agriculture. There are so many months that people don't really do anything, but some months they probably overwork as well. So we'll have to look at this aspect of seasonal employment that happens everywhere. This is very quick view. I picked up a chart where you can see the difference between the energy spent of the bottom urban dweller versus the top urban dweller, the blue dots that you see, and the red dots actually for the rural sector. So in both sectors there is enough spread. But the spread in the urban sector is pretty high. We are talking to close to less than 100 to more than 1,000. So you're talking about a spread of 10 times in terms of energy use in these two buckets, and which is pretty high. Now I come to some of the agricultural aspects, and one of the aspects is resource-intensive agriculture. And when I say resource-intensive agriculture, there are a few parts. Now, as you dig deeper, you are actually releasing a lot of carbon which is otherwise sequestered in soil. And we don't even consider that there will be something happening if we dig deeper. And I think it's an important factor which we should consider and find out if there are alternate ways. Increasing use of fertilizers. So making fertilizers is a very energy intensive business. And increasing use of fertilizers for the sake of it, because somebody else is doing it, is not necessarily right. But making sure that you are in a position to decide how much fertilizer should be used and try to see if we can use only as much, it's going to be helpful. It is very difficult to say that you transition to organic tomorrow because the yields could plummet. We have had an example in Sri Lanka as one of the factors why they had tremendous issues for economy. But the point is that yes, if there is a graded transition that is possible, yes, of course it has to be planned. But at least until then, we want to make sure that your fertilizer use can be reduced. And that can be reduced if the available biomass which comes out of your farms can be redeployed. Because that biomass actually does have nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, if it can be redeployed, there is a potential that you can decrease the need for additional chemical fertilizers. Another thing that happens is that for more fertilization also means that you need to add more water. And that becomes an issue. And even while yesterday, Professor Tare, we were talking in the evening, said that many times this additional nitrogen and phosphorus doesn't reach aquifers. Different parts of the country have different strata, and therefore, in some parts it may not reach, but there are many parts where it reaches as well, which means that finally it lands up in oceans, and you have this aspect of overload of nitrogen and phosphorus, correspondingly algal growth and so on and so forth. So effectively, we are talking about increasing energy requirement in our agriculture sector, and because the fertility of the soil continues to reduce if we over-fertilize using the external fertilizers, you are essentially saying that I'm going to need more fertilizers, which is the aspect of further energy increase and use that is required. I talked about this, that rain-fed agriculture we have to look at. It is insufficient focus, and even though there are a few organizations who focus on rain-fed agriculture, this is one of the very important subjects which actually the institutions like IITs or other science institutions can take up, agricultural universities can take up and figure out what are possibilities. Just to mention a couple of things, that from an ecological perspective, if you have bigger diversity, you have better resilience. Which means that even if there are changes in climate, even if there is more rainfall or less rainfall, it is likely that some or the other species would survive and be able to provide you biomass and food. So aspects of agroforestry and aspect of agriculture, ecological agriculture become very important aspects when we talk about this or combating this issue of how to create more secure rain-fed agriculture. This has been done for 30 years, 40 years, and Anand is here, and he will tell you that Sitara has done so much of work in this particular area. But the dissemination has been extremely poor for whatever reasons. We do not exactly know the reasons as yet, and maybe that he has some interesting insights why that has happened. But then, can we look at some of the alternatives and whether that alternatives can work? Biomethanation, using methane for local electricity for production, and using everything else to go back to the farm to minimize fertilizer use seems to be one of the possibilities, in rural sectors. This is where I'm pretty sure, the energy use is going to increase. Our cement production is increasing, our steel production is increasing, and there is a need for pakka houses for people living in urban areas, etc. You really have a pathetic situation when we look at some of these areas where urban poor live. So therefore again, this is a problem stated that can we find ways to build houses with minimum energy input, both in making and using. And so I think I'm trying to put more problems than solutions, and it's worth looking at some of the things which are not being talked about. So this is where we probably would like to be. Again, it's my version of where we would like to be, but there would be many more or different ways in which people look at it. The crux is, are we able to manage our natural resources sustainably? And when I say natural resources, they are both abiotic and biotic. When we talk about natural capital, can we continue to rebuild natural capital? Like what 14 Trees is attempting to do, that you are rebuilding natural capital, restoring nature in some form or shape. Abiotic resources, how can we continuously reuse them? Now there have been attempts at even reusing the C&D waste, the construction and demolition waste. So these are, I think, very important areas because you have to put them back into a cycle And how can we actually do that? Again, that means that we can cut down on overall energy use maybe by 30, 40, 50, sometimes even 80% when some of the existing materials go back into use. We want to make sure that we have better climate resilience. We know that climate change is happening, it is there, rain is going to be there, intense rainfalls, etc. are going to be there, droughts are going to be there. How can we make sure that we see resilience being built into the solutions that we design for the future? Today, the nature of employment, especially in manufacturing or for that matter any other field, needs enormous amount of additional energy input. Because that you already have automated to a particular level, which means that any additional person you are talking about increasing production. And increasing production by that, multiply by 2, multiply by 3, you have automated most of the stuff, right? And that means that every additional employment requires far more energy. Now here, you have to go back and say that can you create aspirational green jobs? When I say green job is something which doesn't increase your energy use at the least. If it decreases, that's fantastic. Behavioral changes, we have talked about that, we don't know yet, but I think if we engage enough with the psychologists, behavioral scientists, we could potentially find some of these ways in terms of how behavioral changes can happen. And then the changing the way we consume, gave an example of light. Similarly, I can give an example of even air conditioning, right? We have an air conditioned office here, but do we really need? We are concerned about comfort, we are not concerned about air conditioning. Can we create this space which is comfortable but does not need air conditioning? So these are, I think, some of the aspects when we talk about end-use focus. And that's again connecting with what Dr. Pandit was talking in the morning, that you need to look at the demand side. You need to look at the end-use aspect very, very clearly. And then, of course, last has been talked about many times is moving from linear paradigm to circular. I will also want to talk about waste. Because unfortunately a very, very large part of, and I'll only focus on food waste, as probably I'll give you some statistic for the US. US wastes around 40% of cooked food, and then that means that all the energy that is made, used during cooking is wasted, all the energy that is used growing the food is wasted, etc., etc. And in India too, we waste in various ways. In terms of, we do not have good facilities to store food that is grown. We do not have, good enough facilities. And in the urban sector, we also do, we also waste food a lot. Now, this is one very huge lever, where we have an opportunity to reduce carbon emission. Unfortunately, it has not happened so far. There have been many attempts which have been done in the Western world, but we'll have to also look at in our context what we can do for this particular lever. And I think these are some of the very important areas. Reforestation, plantation, one experiment where the experiment is not, Sotin trees experiment is not an ecological restoration experiment alone. It is a social ecological experiment. Because all people around are involved in it, and we also have to ensure that this involvement continues, and the whole experiment becomes bigger and more successful. This is about reforestation or restoration of barren lands, etc., which create carbon sinks. As much as that, there are many other ecosystems which can and which should be restored. And in the morning, I just talked about one statement where I said, you are saying wetlands are wastelands and filling them up, putting buildings on top of them, which is actually a carbon intensive exercise. But these wetlands actually are carbon sinks. They are serious carbon stores. So I think we have to look at ecosystems like wetlands and how to restore them. In India, we have recognized 2,000 natural wetlands and around 65,000 man-made wetlands. When I say man-made wetlands, most of these are dams, small and big, over the whole country. So I think if you're talking about these types of numbers, you are able to manage these well. These have enormous potential of being carbon sinks. Restoration. We also touch upon the water security aspect a little bit because and we talked a lot about aspects of waste and wastewater and how do we treat that in the urban context, etc. But if we are able to regenerate some of these streams which are upstream, and we start talking about upstream, creating appropriate riparian zones, aquatic diversity, I think again there is a potential for added sequestration. Mangroves are fabulous, ecosystems, and these ecosystems were kind of unknown to many people many years ago. And as we realized when first tsunami struck, we started realizing the importance of mangroves. But mangroves again are big sinks of carbon, and if you remove a mangrove, it's almost that you cannot reconstruct it. So conservation of mangroves is mangrove forests is very crucial, and we should ensure that what happens otherwise is we actually release a whole lot of carbon if you don't conserve, ecosystems like mangroves. This is another way where there is something that we can do. Biochar. I think Sri Krishna alluded in one of his answers in the morning about pyrolysis, and pyrolysis creates biochar if we use some of the farm waste and woody material and etc. And that can be used and mixed with soil for improving soil quality. And as you probably know that most of the so-called chemical fertilizers uptake is only because there are microbes. If you decide there are no microbes, any amount of chemical fertilizer is not going to get to the plant. So if you provide habitats for these microbes, which come very well with biochar, when mixed with soil, there is an opportunity that on one side we actually sequester carbon, and on the other side we are improving the soil quality. So it's actually a dual advantage if we use some of these techniques as well. We are talking about tree-based agriculture programs for creating better resilience, whereby you have options. So it's not always saying that I have a monoculture, I have only paddy, I have only wheat, and if that doesn't happen, I don't have any income. So there is an opportunity to ensure that these income streams can be multiplied, and that is going to be an important aspect from an ecological and agricultural perspective. And this is actually another thing which is completely ignored, which is create wilderness spaces around cities. Now what does that do? It does many things, apart from making us happy, to go see some greenery. You are creating some habitats, you are creating diversity, you are creating opportunity for those who want to do farming around the urban areas, because pollination and related pollination agents can thrive in some of these wilderness areas as well. And these can of course act as small or big carbon sinks as well. So I think this is again a very quick list of all that we talked about. I will skip this. So I think to kind of summarize, we need to change the perspective. We want to change the perspective, we want to go from linear to circular, and we start managing gross energy use. We don't want to manage and say that, okay, I am spending so much for making this device, can I spend 50% less for making this device? That's not enough. I have to look at the gross energy use from a management perspective and from a policy perspective. And the second, altering the way we consume, I have already talked about. I would like to put some aspects together as a summary. So focus on end use, very important. Build systems to support this focus. So for example, tomorrow you said, yes, I want to actually convert this room into something which offers comfort and not really air conditioning. But is somebody going to take the responsibility of making you comfortable? You will need a surrounding systems to support some of these ideas as well. There are many hurdles in operationalizing these systems. It's not easy. There is a consumer mindset, there is a seller mindset, there is a manufacturer mindset, there are policies. Now if you are able to make some of these things easier for operationalization, only then some of these things can happen. Incentivizing consumers. So consumers today say that, no, I want to buy one time, then I'm done, right? So he will buy a big capital asset rather than saying that I will lease or I will rent a service, for example. In India especially, that is still very true. And so can we incentivize? Can we actually move the consumers to realize the benefits of this? So with this I will stop. I have just kind of laid down what all things are possible from this context, and would be good to discuss more. Yes, sir.
Yeah, we have about 12 minutes for questions.
So a couple of points. One is a rejoinder to the numbers on restoration potential. I'm not going to quibble about the percent, but we did a study when I was at A3 just to look at peninsular India, which would mean the dry or the arid zones and the subhumid zones. And just in that zone, we actually got down to the pixel levels to quantify what is the potential for restoration in peninsular India. And the numbers are that there is an opportunity to restore about 13 million hectares, which is a substantial part of India's NDC 3 commitments. Okay? This is just peninsular India.
Right.
There's much more. Now, out of that 13 million hectares, about 10 million hectares is actually degraded agricultural land. About 1 million hectares is basically riparian habitat. And 2 million hectares are essentially some wetlands, but largely the kind of mountain tops that you see at Noor.
Barren mountain tops.
So that's the approximate size of the opportunity for scaling, okay, where you can look at a set of reasonably uniform, I'm going to use the word uniform, but reasonably similar technologies in reasonably similar environments where you can actually design for scale. So it is in fact possible to look at scaling in a very different way, where you don't start with just the technology, but you look at the end use considerations and the ecosystems that are there and design for those and so on. And all these are very impoverished areas, actually sitting on an opportunity. Let's turn the tables on this. This is actually an opportunity.
Right.
Okay. So that's the first point. The second is I'd like to add a little twist to the argument about gross use over efficiency. In the case of energy, where we know that aspirations are going to require increase in use in any case, where there was none. So for example, when lighting and first from incandescents to CFLs and then CFLs to LEDs, that transition occurred 25 years ago it started. We knew that lighting is a requirement and it is going to increase. We may be able to say the same thing with cooling today, whether it's storage or whether it's space cooling. But since we knew that the end use is going to increase, it was very critical to have efficient end uses so that we are not locked into end use technologies which are wasteful and then you have to replace them. So sometimes that requires leapfrogging, which would be useful not after the fact, which is I think what you were referring to, but before the fact.
Correct.
So I think that aspect of increasing efficiency, I would add a second point to that says that if you are projecting that growth to happen, then in fact efficiency could come immediately. And the use will increase, but essentially it won't be as bad. You'll be able to provide the same level of services
Within the same envelope.
with the same use. So I would just qualify that. That's all.
Ajay,
Yeah.
We are just about out of time, so it was
So maybe just one last question.
No, it's not so much a question. One observation. I probably had made this mention in Pune, but we have a lot of people over here who were not present for that meeting. So one is, we mentioned a lot of things in your presentation, and somewhere one doesn't get a sense of prioritization, And I'd like to point out, for example, if you look at simple common sense energy of your own households, forget the world at large. Let's talk of your house, right? What's the biggest contributor to energy in your house? Which are the stuff which is using the highest energy? Can you tell me? Air conditioning, no, not appliances.
So you're asking.
Maybe if you don't have an AC at home, I'm very happy. I don't have one. Okay, we have a lot of fights at home for that reason, right? And Pune is heating up, and I stay on the top floor, right? So it's a very difficult battle that I fight at home every day, saying as a policy we will not use air conditioning, but by and large, right? Air conditioning is the biggest contributor, and places like IIT, I think we need to worry a lot about how we can get natural ventilation, or if we have air conditioning, how can we have norms for temperature? For example, I'm sitting in a room where I'm shivering for the last 6 hours. I'm wearing shorts, so that kind of makes the problem more, right? But what if we increased it by 3 degrees Celsius? We would have saved at least 10 units of electricity, so much, right? So is there some thinking that's going on by people who build infrastructure, by governments which make norms, for Infosys, which has got probably one of the biggest air conditioned spaces in the country, right? As to what is it that you guys can do about reducing your AC loads? Because I'm not even talking of people now, you've got server farms which are like one Google search takes the same energy as 1 cup of coffee. Right? We do so many of them every day, right? We don't even think about these things. I'm sorry, I'm kind of being a bit more critical towards the IT industry here. I shouldn't be saying that, but right? So that's one observation, right? And second is, we started the day, we're almost like 2/3 way through it, right? Where we said we're talking about action points, right? So all of us are here, I'm sorry, we've not had too many action points coming, but I think what I proposed in Pune, and I'm repeating the same over here, is let's start with your own personal electricity bills. What are they today, and where can we get them down to? So if I'm spending 3,000 rupees a month on electricity, can I get it down to 2,500? Ask that question personally, then, कांच के घर में रहने वाले पत्थर नहीं फेंकते. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ajay.